This is Michael de Laine of the Copenhagen Voice at a Baltic Sea cleanup conference in Gdansk. With me is Daniel Colney of Lund University. Daniel has been studying the Baltic Sea and sort of why it's as polluted as it is. And, well, Daniel, what's the historical background for the situation today?
Well, the historical background is that today we have extensive amounts of hypoxia. And hypoxia is the lack of oxygen in the water. And it's where oxygen gets so low that it starts to affect fish and living organisms and eventually kill them. And it's very prevalent in the Baltic Sea today. And one of the questions is how long has it been there?
Do we know?
I think we do know. Over the last few years of our studies, we've summarized all the work that's been done on the Baltic Sea. And one of the things that we have observed is that hypoxia occurred very early in the Baltic Sea history, during its first 4,000 to 8,000 years. And it disappeared for 3,000 years, appeared again during the medieval warm period, and then disappeared for another 800 years, and then came back at the turn of the 19th century, in 1900.
Have you seen any correlation between those changes and the changes in the temperature or climate we've seen on a wider scale?
We think that climate has some things to do with hypoxia in the Baltic, but so far most of our research shows that it's the nutrients coming in from different sources that are affecting hypoxia.
And by nutrients you mean things like nitrogen, phosphorus?
Things like nitrogen and phosphorus that come into the water, that grow algae, that algae decompose, and the algae die, go to the bottom and decompose and consume oxygen. And they suck up all the oxygen out of the bottom waters.
So where do these nutrients come from?
Oh, that's a good question. They come from a whole variety of different sources. Agriculture is one of the biggest inputs of nitrogen and to the Baltic Sea, and some of phosphorus, but also other things like wastewater treatment plants can put in substantial amounts of phosphorus and also nitrogen. And probably the third biggest source is atmospheric deposition, coming from the burning of fossil fuels.
So it sounds like modern life is a great contributor to the Baltic Sea situation.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, everything that we do seems to have an impact on the environment. And of course we need to live. We need to be able to grow crops and eat. But we can do it in a much more sustainable fashion than we're doing it today.
But isn't this washed out into the North Sea from the Baltic?
Yeah, eventually it is. I mean, this is the problem, is that you start to affect downstream ecosystems. So things that happen in the northern Baltic Sea, many of the nutrients get processed and some of them get sequestered, but many of them wash out of the Baltic Sea into the Danish coastal waters, for example, and into the North Sea. So you can create a whole string of problems along the entire land-ocean continuum, as we call it.
But you also got salt water coming in from the North Sea, at times at least, into what is otherwise a freshwater sea, right?
Right. The Baltic is known as an inland sea, and it's inland because it's completely surrounded by land. And the saltwater inputs are actually governed by sills, shallow areas that control how much water flows in. And the amount varies through time due to a variety of different factors, including climate and sea level.
What happens when these two waters mix? Is that good or bad? Because
I think that's good. Many systems, these systems where you have salt and freshwater mixing, are called estuaries, and they are found all over the world. And in most systems, it doesn't. It's just an important ecosystem. In the Baltic, the problem is that the renewal of water in the bottom takes a very long time period. So any materials that we put down to the bottom, like algae, decompose and cause a problem with oxygen depletion.
So the salt water coming in from the North Sea, which brings oxygen with it, the oxygen is also consumed by the dying or the dead algae
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it brings in fresh oxygen, but it gets consumed along the way. And so the salt water is nice because it brings in oxygen, but it also brings in salt, and salt creates stratification. It's much heavier than fresh water, so it forms these layers on the bottom, and it means these layers aren't mixed. And when it's not ventilated, when the water doesn't circulate, that's when it causes problems.
I know you've been at Maja Fjord in Denmark, which had rather a problem in, was it 1997?
1997, it was
Yes.
quite spectacular. It
Yes.
went completely anoxic. It had no oxygen from 35 meters deep up into the surface.
But the local communities then started pumping oxygen into the fjord.
No, that's not true
It's not
at
true.
all. No, they waited for the oxygen to come back. It took about a period of 2 weeks before the oxygen came back in the fjord, and still the bottom waters are more or less permanently anoxic, and have been for at least 100 years that we know of.
But couldn't you just pump oxygen into the...
In a small system like Maja Fjord, you might be able to do that. If you did that, you would change the ecology of the system, because you would change the mixing and a variety of other processes. But in a small place like Maja Fjord, you might be able to accomplish that if you were willing to give up the other attributes of the estuary. But in the place like the Baltic Sea, that's so incredibly huge, the hypoxic area is on the order of 41,000 kilometers squared every year, and that's the size of Denmark. So
And that's
it's a
what,
huge problem.
9-10% of the whole Baltic.
Something like that, something like 10% of
So
the
it's
Baltic.
quite a large...
And if you think of the more of the Baltic proper, it's a larger share. You know, the Baltic has these very large basins, the Bothnian Sea and the Bothnian Bay, further north, that are not as heavily impacted by man.
So how do you're an oceanographer,
I'm an oceanographer, yes.
how do you look upon the solutions to the situation?
I think the solutions are simple. We've known this for a long time, but they're very difficult to carry out. We have to reduce nutrients, and we have to reduce them from a variety of different sources. We have to reduce them from agriculture. We especially have to take into account hotspots, places where you have intensive animal farms or intensive farming that tends to release lots of nutrients. We need to reduce the fossil fuels that we're burning. And we need to also put treatment on wastewater treatment plants.
The wastewater treatment, we've seen from what NEFCA has been saying, that they're doing quite a bit of funding, which is seeing large reductions. What about the agricultural side? Is that much more difficult?
It's much more difficult because point sources are easy because you have usually one place. Places like St. Petersburg are a little bit more difficult because you have 3 large sewage treatment plants, but many cities might have 1 or 2, so it's easier to address. You have to address 10,000 farms or whatever the number is. It's a much larger number to address, and much more difficult.
Okay, I'm going to stop that here, if it will.